Resources Minister Gwede Mantashe has finally released details of the third iteration of the mining charter, saying it's expected to help boost economic growth. He says it's the culmination of a 7-month-long process of intense engagement with all stakeholders in the sector and really the best way forward for the industry. He unveiled the 2018 version of the charter at a briefing in Pretoria today. Ntokozo Ngcwabe is a member of the mining charter drafting team and joins us now to take us through some of what was announced a little earlier. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for talking to us tonight. Firstly, I must ask you, just how extensive was the engagement that led us to where we are today?
Good evening, Bongani, and the viewers at home. You know, this process was really an intense engagement process. We had to engage with our stakeholders, from representatives of the mining industry, the interested and affected communities, host communities and organized labor, the legal fraternity, a wide range of stakeholders. And it was really intense because we started engaging with them at the beginning of the year, and we gazetted in June, and after gazetting we held a mining charter summit with all the stakeholders from 9 provinces and allowed them to give us written submissions, and post the closure period for submissions, we still engaged them and gave them feedback on the written submissions that they gave us. So it was really robust and intense. Really.
So we understand, I mean, from what the Minister was saying today, that it's finally going to provide much of the needed regulatory and political certainty around what the sector is going to, or can expect going forward.
Yes. This iteration is really going to provide that regulatory certainty that our stakeholders have been unhappy about. Firstly, because insofar as the requirements for ownership, particularly on existing mining rights, we've said if you compare the gazetted draft, the one that was gazetted in June, and the final draft that was gazetted today, on existing mining rights, we had said they would have to top up from 26 to 30%. But now with the final charter, after having engaged with our stakeholders, we are saying they do not have to top up to 30%. We are giving them that certainty that you've got the right on the terms and conditions under which it was granted to you, because that right would have been granted when the requirement was that the BE shareholding must be at 26%. So we are providing that regulatory certainty, and we're saying that will be recognized for the duration of the right.
Let me ask you this. I mean, the thrust of this new charter is around profit seeking that places, you could say, the rights of host communities, for example, at the center of how mining should happen, whether that's employment or local procurement. What do you say to those who are still opposed to all of this philosophically, who say, ultimately, investors are looking to see where they can make the most money? Why should they come here if they can get better returns elsewhere?
Well, Bongani, as the drafting team, we engaged firstly amongst ourselves, and in that process of engaging as a team, as the drafting team, we also did some benchmarking studies against other countries, and it became very clear to us that this notion of a carried interest is not new to South Africa. You know, it's done elsewhere in other African countries, and it's really not something out of the ordinary. And if you look at the exposure of these communities, the host communities particularly, to environmental impacts, health impacts where the mining is happening, and the fact that these minerals are owned by South Africans and are held in custody by the state, we thought it would only be fair that they also get a shareholding, a percentage in the operations. And I do not believe that there would be any stakeholder after such extensive engagements and consultations who would say they are opposed to this.
So funny you should say that, because of course the minister also told that press briefing that part of your site visits included the community of Xolobeni in the Eastern Cape. And there very much the issue on the table is whether or not there can be the kind of sustainable development the minister spoke about. Many of those who oppose it in that community say it's impossible.
Well, if you listened to the minister's speech this morning, he did outline that when he went there over the weekend, he met a number of stakeholders in that community from different structures. And out of 10, 9 were saying they are pro-mining in that area, because that particular area where this application is the most poverty-stricken in that municipality. So he is committed to continue engaging those stakeholders in that community particularly until a resolution is reached. And really, I think what is important for us to note as well is that we are not saying mining over tourism, but we are saying coexistence. I mean, we've seen it elsewhere, it's happening. And if you look at the type and nature of projects we're talking about in Xolobeni, it's exactly similar to the Richards Bay Minerals project, where you still have your tourism coexisting with mining. That's for the development of that particular community.
But it's not just tourism that seems to be the issue. Firstly, there is an allegation from some community members who say they were locked out of those engagements with the minister. So you can talk about 9 out of 10 in support. Many of the voices against say they weren't given a chance to participate. And really, of course, the main concern has been precisely that the environmental degradation from mining in that area will mean that the landscape will be changed and people will literally no longer be able to grow their own crops or indeed raise livestock after the mining, the life cycle of the mining is over.
Bongani, Minister took an approach that everyone is welcome into the meeting. Those that are against mining in that area were invited into the meeting.
They say they were locked out.
They went into the marquee and then they started disrupting the meeting, and they had then to be taken out of the meeting so that the meeting could proceed. Otherwise, at the end of it all, they did have a representative who also made a representation at the meeting. They were invited to be part of the meeting and express their views. Now, on the question of environmental degradation, our law dictates that when we issue a mining right, we issue it along with the approval of an environmental authorization. And ordinarily, that environmental authorization would be accompanied by an environmental management program, which then details how the rehabilitation of the area would be done. And again, I will take you back to the Richards Bay Minerals project, because it's exactly similar to this one. And if you go there, you wouldn't tell the difference from an area that's been mined and rehabilitated and virgin ground that's never been touched.
As you point out, I mean, most of the stakeholders in terms of the responses to what was announced today have welcomed the developments. And of course, one of the contentious issues that seems to have been resolved is around ownership and whether or not, of course, deals that have been previously entered into can be sustained going forward. So mostly positive responses to the announcement today.
Yes, Bongani, like I said, on ownership, particularly on existing rights, we have said we will not tamper with them. We will recognize their compliance for the duration of their mining rights. And on pending applications, we are saying those applications would have been lodged with the department before the gazetting of this charter today. Those applications would be processed in terms of the 2010 charter, of which the requirement for BEE shareholding is 26%. But upon granting of those mining rights, we are then giving them a 5-year transitional period to top up from 26 to 30%. And we feel really that that is the strongest point insofar as providing that regulatory certainty. And then the last regime, which has to do with new mining rights, those would have to comply with the full 30% from the onset, because they would have been lodged after the gazetting of this charter today.
I thought it was a particular point, of course, that the inclusion in particular of women in terms of the ownership breakdown that was announced today, I thought that was a key development that we hadn't quite seen in this way before.
Yes, we've said on the 20% for the black entrepreneurs, 5% is should be preferably allocated for women entrepreneurs, and we did that particularly because it is a well-known fact that women have been disadvantaged over time in terms of participating in the mainstream economy and different on all other forms of discrimination. So we had to really make that provision for women specifically.
Tell me about the change in terms of the withdrawal of the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Amendment Bill. Why was that issue withdrawn from Parliament?
Bongani, the MPRDA bill went to Parliament in 2013. Now, between 2013 and today, it's been a good 5 years. And it was there before Parliament, it was in the NCOP, and provinces were just not finding each other on certain aspects, particularly on consultation. Every provincial representative was reluctant, to let go of their provincial mandate. And looking at the fact that there hasn't been any movement towards finalizing the bill, we thought that also plays into this space of regulatory uncertainty. And we therefore advised that it would be best for the MPRDA bill to be withdrawn, rather, so that the industry has that regulatory certainty, because then it means that the MPRDA is applicable in its current form.
Wasn't there also an issue around proposals for government's share, particularly in new oil and gas projects? Wasn't also that an issue that many of those who were opposed to the bill in its current form were raising?
Well, Bongani, the withdrawal of the MPRDA essentially has led us to get to a point where we've decided that we are going to be developing a new legislative framework for the oil and gas sector, and that detail then would be in that bill that we will be developing.
Are there any lessons learned from this process? I mean, the minister was at pains to say today that everybody had been engaged with repeatedly over time. Are there any lessons to be learned in terms of how government approaches this kind of legislation, given the mistakes, the very obvious mistakes we saw with former Minister Mosebenzi Zwane?
Well, we've got a lot of lessons that we've learned out of this process, particularly insofar as consultation and engaging as different stakeholders is concerned, because we, as the department, are representing communities. We are representing South Africans, the ordinary South African out in the street. And then you've got industry whose interest is in profit making. Then you've got organized labor looking at the best interest of workers. And if those stakeholders cannot sit in one room without being at each other's throat, then it's problematic. So the one lesson that we learned out of this process is that it is very important to engage all your stakeholders, whether you disagree or agree on issues, but you still engage and find some common ground at the end of the process. So that's really been the biggest thing for us out of this.
We've seen, of course, throughout this year, the mining sector consistently under pressure, already shedding jobs with more to come. Is this in any way some light at the end of the tunnel?
You know, if you look at mining in its nature is cyclical. And if you look at the results, the stats that were announced a few weeks ago by Stats SA, it showed a positive outlook for the mining sector. So we continue to monitor the performance of the sector, and we are confident that we are going to be seeing an upswing in the sector where we recover. And really, the provision of regulatory certainty as well is at the center of it. So we are closely monitoring the trends in the sector, and how do we respond to the trends as they happen is going to be key for us.
Regulatory certainty, political certainty, and perhaps we could argue a bit of a climb down by the Mineral Resources Department. We thank you so much for giving us this information and reflections this evening. Thank you so much there, of course, to Ntokozo Ngcwabe, who was a member of the Mining Charter drafting team, talking to us from our Pretoria studios. You remember, of course, there was a lot of controversy when the second iteration of the Mining Charter under former Minister Mosebenzi Zwane was released. It does appear now that at least all sides are talking to each other. Many positive responses to what was announced by Minister Mantashe a little earlier today. Now,